Elon Musk has warned that civilizational suicidal empathy is tearing the West apart. But the problem isn't empathy itself, it's what people think is empathy. In personal relationships, this manifests when a young woman repeatedly seeks out abusive partners, convincing herself that she can change them. If she chooses to live that way, it's her decision. The same is true on a larger scale. Activists who preach civilizational suicidal empathy may not be part of a grand conspiracy, as Musk suggests. Instead, many of them may be trapped in a psychological pattern they don't even recognize, one rooted in personal trauma. The reason is simple. They mistake the temporary emotional high of pleasing dangerous people for actual progress. Their worldview is shaped not by rational problem-solving or critical thinking, but by an instinctive drive to recreate a sense of relief by seeking the approval of those who should never have been appeased in the first place. This brings us to the stories of three individuals, each shaped by their past, each driven by a need to please the wrong people, and each playing a role in what Musk calls the empathy glitch. The cost of acceptance, from exploitation to extremism. Noah had always felt like an outsider. Growing up in a strict Jewish household, his family couldn't quite understand him. His quiet detachment, his obsessive focus on specific topics, his inability to read social cues. They assumed he was just difficult, but in reality, he was living with undiagnosed high-spectrum autism. His mind worked differently, and because no one could explain it to him or themselves, he drifted further and further away. Not only did Noah struggle to connect with his family, but he also found it nearly impossible to relate to the rest of the world. Social interactions were a puzzle he couldn't solve. Worst of all, his isolation extended to intimacy. He could never quite bridge the gap between himself and the woman he longed to understand. It was frustrating, lonely, and at times unbearable. That changed when he met Daniel, a charming and confident man who recognized something in him. Unlike others, Daniel saw value in Noah's youthful features, vulnerability, and desperate need to belong. For the first time, Noah felt wanted. The warmth of human connection was intoxicating, and he followed Daniel eagerly into his world. The nightlife, the clubs, the new friends who welcomed him in. But Daniel's charm only lasted as long as Noah gave him what he wanted. He wasn't a friend, he was a manipulator, a businessman, a pimp. And Noah, naive and eager to please, found himself in a new role, not as a partner, but as a product. Unlike many who were swallowed whole by that world, Noah managed to escape. With his relentless drive and the contacts he had made, he reinvented himself. His sharp mind, honed by years of social observation and adaptation, allowed him to carve out a place in the media. He built a career, a brand, and an empire. He had the wealth, the fame, and, most importantly, the belonging he had always craved. But Noah never truly escaped the scars of his past. The trauma of his early years left him with a deep, unconscious compulsion, what some might call suicidal empathy. He had spent his youth appeasing predators, mistaking control for care, submission for strength. And so, when he became a leader in the LGBTQ movement, he carried that same impulse into his activism. Noah didn't just advocate for LGBTQ rights, he became an unwavering champion of its most extreme factions. He defended radicals who sought destruction, believing that their rage was justified. He saw terrorists in his homeland of Israel and criminals in the cities as victims and called them heroes. He viewed any backlash not as a consequence of dangerous ideologies, but as proof that society needed even more radical change. Neither he nor his family fully grasped why he was so deeply committed to these beliefs. It was one thing to be frustrated with the violence in Israel, most people were, but why would he openly defend the actions of a terrorist group that would not only target him for being Jewish, but also for his LGBTQ identity? While outsiders recognized his intelligence, persuasive rhetoric, and sharp reasoning, they failed to see the hidden wounds that drove him. Like a battered wife returning to her abuser, Noah gravitated toward those who would ultimately exploit and discard him. His activism was less about justice and more about reconstructing the dynamics of his past, where pain signified belonging and submission felt like survival. Samuel Grayson always saw himself as a man of peace. Time and again, he sought out the most hostile figures in the Democratic Party, men who had spent their careers crafting laws to maintain racial segregation and oppression. But Samuel was convinced that change would follow if he could talk to them and find common ground. The meetings always ended the same way: warm handshakes, pleasant conversations, and empty concessions that amounted to little more than symbolic gestures. What he never realized was that his optimism was not courage, it was cowardice. Like a battered wife convincing herself that her husband's apologies meant real change, Samuel kept returning to men who had no intention of altering the system. The fight for civil rights shifted as the years went on, but Samuel's approach did not. When it came time to address the growing crises in urban America, he applied the same flawed logic. Instead of standing alongside the hard-working, law-abiding black families trying to build a better future, he sought out the most dangerous elements in the community: the gang leaders, the career criminals, the drug lords. In the 1960s, black communities had lower crime rates than most white areas. Decades later, after years of civilizational suicidal empathy, urban America had become a battleground where the innocent were left defenseless and the most ruthless were appeased in the name of understanding. Samuel never saw himself as an appeaser. He always believed he was working for peace, but in his relentless need to avoid confrontation, he became a servant to the forces he should have fought against. His story was not one of courage, but of a man who never realized that shaking hands with the enemy only strengthened their grip on power. Eleanor always believed in people. Growing up in a privileged, progressive household, she was taught that patience and understanding were virtues. So, when she fell for Julian, a hyper-driven tech entrepreneur, she convinced herself that his ruthlessness was just part of his genius. He was relentless and often cold, but she saw it as her role to smooth out his rough edges and support him in ways he couldn't help himself. But Julian's ambition wasn't just an abstract drive. It was a hunger that consumed everything, including Eleanor. He dismissed her concerns, belittled her instincts, and treated her as little more than an accessory to his empire. For years she endured, convincing herself that her patience was a strength rather than a slow erosion of self-worth. When she finally left, it wasn't because she had stopped appeasing him, it was because he no longer needed her and she knew it. The divorce settlement was enormous, granting Eleanor a fortune that could change lives. With that wealth, she saw an opportunity to reshape the world in a way she had failed to reshape her marriage. But old habits die hard. Just as she had enabled Julian, she now funneled her fortune into organizations that reflected her worldview, groups that focused on performative change rather than addressing actual power structures. Worse, many of these organizations promoted what could only be described as civilizational suicidal empathy, an unchecked, self-destructive altruism that prioritized feelings over function. Instead of helping those who truly needed a second chance, these groups often directed resources towards those who had no intention of reforming, ignoring the real victims in the process. Once again, Eleanor found herself in the role of the appeaser, mistaking indulgence for kindness and surrender for generosity. Her philanthropy was celebrated, yet it reinforced the same cycle that had defined her life, giving endlessly without demanding accountability. The people she funded weren't the ones challenging power, but the ones enabling it, just as she had once enabled Julian. What began as an attempt to correct capitalism's failures had ironically become another exercise in appeasement, this time on a global scale. If history has shown us anything, unchecked appeasement leads not to peace, but to deeper chaos. The individuals in these stories represent a mindset that has played out countless times in politics, activism, and personal relationships. A mindset that mistakes submission for morality and momentary harmony for progress. The consequences have been devastating, from urban decay to political instability to the slow unraveling of Western civilization itself. The solution is not to abandon empathy, but to distinguish real compassion from destructive appeasement. Genuine empathy means defending the innocent, not indulging the worst elements of society. It means holding people accountable, not excusing their actions in the name of understanding. Courage isn't found in making villains happy. but standing firm against those who seek to manipulate and destroy.